how I made the impossible trade between Gen 2 and Gen 3. So, as many of you will know, Gen 2 and Gen 3, you cannot go to, RBY, Gen 1, GSC, Gen 2, cannot physically transfer up to Gen 3, Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, RSE, Fire, Red, Leaf, Green, FR, right? It just can't be done. There was originally talks, as far as I'm aware, from Game Freak, Pokemon Company right now, and it just never came to fruition. Apparently the hardware wasn't there. There were things there that made it so that a lot of Pokemon got lost in Gen 1 and Gen 2. No Gen 1 Mews can technically exist outside of using proprietary hardware, homebrew, custom software, etc. on modern hardware. So if you say back in the day went to, I believe it was a Toys R Us event, right, and got a Mew in your red and blue, or if you happen to be lucky and get the Belly Drum Whooper, for example, and I think it was Crystal, GSC, you couldn't transfer that up to Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald. Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald was, for all intents and purposes, a cut in the sand. We are going forward from this point, and a lot of Pokemon got left in Gen 1 and Gen 2. But Goppier, having made that impossible trade, I want to make sure that I want to see this. I want to understand this process, because this greatly intrigues me.
A trade between the Gen 2 Pokemon games and the Gen 3 Pokemon games was something that was never a possibility.
No.
So I decided to create some...
He's using a Game Boy player there, which I have. Those discs are expensive now, though. The Z button option, this is the Game Boy player interface. I use it.
So I decided to create something that makes it possible.
Wow.
In case you don't know, when the Gen 3 games were released, it was not possible to transfer over your old Pokemon from Gen 2 to the next generation.
No.
And nowadays, in all of Pokemon, this was the only case where this was not possible.
Mm-hmm.
For example, you could use a time capsule mechanic to make a trade between the Gen 1 and the Gen 2 games.
That's actually where you get cool items, like I think it was, what was it, it wasn't pink ribbon, was it like the spotted ribbon, and then you get the brick. The time capsule is wild.
Another example is between Gen 3 and Gen 4. You could use a mechanic called Pal Park to send over your old Pokemon.
Yes, you
You
did.
would need a DS with a GB.
I did this in high school. I remember sitting in the library, God, like 9th, 10th grade, doing exactly this before class. Just sitting there on top of the DS, on top of the bookcase, just doing this Pal Park migration feature. Oh my God.
By putting both games in the DS,
yep,
you will be able to send over your Pokemon from Gen 3 to Gen 4. So not being able to send over your Pokemon from Gen 2 to Gen 3 is a bit of a shame. Nowadays, people have already found some backdoor ways for transferring over your old Pokemon, like hacking the save file of the Gen 3 games and manually editing in the Pokemon from the old games.
Interesting.
But these methods require a lot of external tools before you can make it work. Nintendo did, however, re-release the first two generations on the 3DS, which finally made it possible to send Pokemon from these games to the latest generation. This is great, but you're not able to send over the Pokemon from these old cartridges.
No.
So that has been the biggest reason for me for making this device, to bridge the gap between the generations and send over my old Pokemon.
This is actually really impressive.
Let's get started. In order to make a trade work between Gen 2 and Gen 3, we will need to reverse engineer the trading protocol. I won't go over all the details of it today, but instead I'll focus on the parts that we need to make our little trade work.
I know he's been jabbing at his quality content, quote unquote, but he's really making quality content. And this is why I like doing React content, right? In certain aspects, absolutely. It definitely has its flaws. It definitely has, it can be disingenuous towards the original creators. What I want to showcase is, one, that this creator exists. For quality like this, only 27,000 subscribers is absolutely incredibly underrated. Definitely go check him out if you haven't. Like, I'm just going to say that right now. Go check him out if you haven't. So he's making quality content. All of his cuts are peak, right? He talks about reverse engineering the trade protocol, right?
And Gen 3.
He's talking about Gen 2 and Gen 3. He has Crystal and he has Emerald. He has relevant footage here.
We'll need to reverse engineer the
oh, we're not doing this the normal way. Right? We need to reverse engineer the trade protocols. Going from this, we're not doing it the old-fashioned way,
protocol,
into this. Like, I've seen creators with hundreds of thousands of like subscribers and views per video that don't do this level of like quality, which is like, I love seeing these. I love seeing people that put the time and the effort into projects like this. This is chef's kiss. Just wanted to take a look at that for a second and just give them like acknowledgement that I see this. This is actually really good editing.
I won't go over all the details of it today, but instead I'll focus on the parts
Also
that we need to
skipping
make our
over-
little trade work.
Skipping over a lot of this,
First,
yeah.
we'll make a trade between two Gen 2 games to
Easy.
get a basic idea of what happens.
Yeah.
And I haven't turned on these games in years. I wonder what kind of Pokemon I had. I remember having a special Celebi from an event and...
It's gonna be wiped.
Oh.
Yep. Battery.
So after doing a little research, I found that the save file is tied to the battery that is
Yes, it is, baby.
inside the cartridge. This means that when the battery runs dry, the save file will be deleted. I guess I didn't expect people to play these games after 20 years.
No.
Anyway,
no,
let's
they
make
didn't.
a quick detour to change the battery. Inside the cartridge is a CR2025 battery. I chose to take the battery out by force, but soldering in a new battery holder might be the better solution. In the end, it doesn't really matter, as long as there's a battery inside the cartridge.
Yeah.
Anyway, now that we've changed the battery, we can close it back up. Now the only thing we need to do is start a new game and make our way up to the point where we can make a trade. Along the way we'll beat our rival and catch some Pokemon to make a trade with. It's a bit of a rocky start, but now we can finally begin to make a trade. To make a trade, we need to get to the trading terminal on the first floor of the Pokemon Center. On the same floor there's also a Colosseum terminal and the time capsule terminal that I mentioned earlier.
I don't think I've actually done the Coliseum in Gen 2, now that I think about it. Actually, didn't Let's Go have like a bottom floor that there's supposed to be a Coliseum? I actually never got to see what that was. I might have to go back and do that.
But we won't need those today. We are only focusing on the trading terminal.
It was a
Here,
delayed
the first
feature.
thing that's checked is if there's another Game Boy connected and if they are ready to start communicating with each other. For this to work, you have to use the link cable for the original Game Boy or the Game Bay Color. This
Yeah.
is because the link cable for the GBA is wired differently.
Interesting.
By the way, this check works on a timeout, so it'll stop trying if there's no communication. Once
makes
the
sense.
game sees that both Game Boys are connected, it then checks if both games are at the correct terminal. For example, it will give an error if one is at the Colosseum terminal and the other player is at the trading terminal.
Right, okay.
So far, no important data has been sent between the two Game Boys. These are just necessary checks in order to further progress the trade.
Yeah.
So once you clear both of these checks, you're able to enter the trading room. In this trading room, there's no data sent at all. You could even pull out the trading cable and nothing would happen.
So it just gives you access to the room. Interesting.
The next time data is sent between the Game Boys is when both players sit down at the trading machine.
Yeah.
And this is where the actual Pokemon data is being sent.
Yeah.
This is the most important part for a trade between Gen 2 and Gen 3. So let's take a closer look at that data. During this screen there's a total of 458 bytes sent, and all this data can be sorted into 5 different sections.
Okay.
The first section is some basic trainer information. In here is stored what the name of the
Trainer ID, name of trainer. Yeah.
trainer is, your trainer ID,
Hours?
and how many Pokemon and what Pokemon you have in your party.
Okay.
The data from this section is all used on the next screen, where you can choose what Pokemon needs to be traded. The second section is the Pokemon data. In
Interesting.
here we can find everything related to the Pokemon. Like for example what moves they have, their IVs and stat experience, and their level and experience. Everything. Except their nickname, the name of the original trainer, and potential mail data. These 3 things are all sent in their own little section afterwards.
Okay.
We will talk about how we will translate all this data to the Gen 3 structure soon. But let's
Interesting.
first finish the trade. This next part is also
It almost looked like you're gonna have to mid-trade, you're gonna have to convert all of that data. So the 458 bytes that it's sending, you're gonna have to convert it into a Gen 3 format, it almost seems like.
really important, because here we can choose what Pokemon needs to be traded. This is done with a simple index where the first Pokemon in your party is index 0 and the last Pokemon is index 5.
Okay.
And once both players have selected their Pokemon to trade, there's one more check to see if both players agree with the trade. Again, this is really important in our trade with Gen 3, because we need to know what Pokemon the other game wants to trade. After
Okay.
both people accept the trade, you'll see the animation of the trade being performed. During this part there's again no data sent, but there's one last check at the end to confirm that the trade went successful.
Okay.
And that is the entire trade for the Gen 2 games.
So
From this trade there are only
during the cutscene, it's not actually sending data. It's you're sending data when you're initiating the trade, and then it prompts a cutscene where no data is being sent back and forth, but it has now unlocked, quote unquote, the cutscene for you.
2 things we really need to worry about. And that is converting the Pokemon data to the Gen 3 structure and
Yes.
sending over the index of what Pokemon we want to trade.
Okay.
Before we start working on this, let's first also boot up the Gen 3 games and make
Fire
a trade
red,
there
baby.
to see if there are any major differences. To make a trade, we need to once again go up to the first floor of the Pokemon Center. The first terminal here is the Union Room for wireless connectivity.
Right.
The second one is for using the link cable, and that is the one we'll be using. Here you can in turn select to trade or battle, and afterwards it'll perform similar checks as before. It again first checks if another Game Boy is connected, and if you have both selected the same option. But for Gen 3 there's one more check added here.
Okay.
It also checks what game you're communicating with and how much progress you've made through the game. This stuff is only really used for a trade between Fire Red or Leaf Green and Ruby, Sapphire or Emerald.
This will check, I'm assuming, if you have the Ruby and Sapphire slotted in the Sevi Islands to make the trade to Hoenn games, the Sevi Isle side quest.
In Fire Red and Leaf Green, you needed to make your way to the Sevi Islands and get the Ruby and Sapphire gem in order to make a trade
I'll take that Kip W. Take
with
that.
the other games. This will in turn set a bid high, and that will notify the other games that a trade can be made. Anyway, back to our trade between Gen 2 and Gen 3. This part can become an issue, but let's first finish the trade before looking for solutions. Okay, so after clearing all of those checks, we are allowed into the trading room. And as we are walking into the trading room, information about the trainer card is sent. In the trading room, you're able to talk to the other player and see the trainer card. This part can become an issue as well, because you're not able to do this in the Gen 2 trade.
No.
For now, we'll just write this down as our second issue to look at. By the way, do you remember?
I'm assuming you'd have to have some sort of placeholder data for trainer card then. It's like some sort of just value in place.
Fun times when we could just pull out the trading cable with the Gen 2 games?
Can't do that in Gen
that's
3.
not possible anymore with the Gen 3 games. There's constant communication with checksums, and if you even look at the cable wrong, it'll give a communication
Yep. I've experienced that.
error. Anyway, back to the trading room. During this part, it's sent what kind of input is made by the Game Boy. Take for example the movements you make in the room. You can see in real time what the other player is doing. In the Gen 2 games, however, the other player is already in their special chair and no communication is made whatsoever. So we'll put this on the list of things to deal with as well. Once both players sit in their chair and are ready to make a trade, we get to the juicy bits. Just like in the Gen 2 games, this is the part where the Pokemon data is being sent. The data itself is obviously very different from the Gen 2 one.
Yeah.
With the Gen 3 adding stuff like a personality value, different structure for IVs and EVs, and overall...
That's something that I think a lot of people overlook, is that the modern IV and EV system began in Gen 3. In Gen 2, I think it was... God, what was it? I know DVs were a thing there, but I can't remember if it was EVs or EVs, I think, were maxed out, and I think it was IVs were DVs. Like, it's a different system entirely.
More data for the Pokemon. Converting this data correctly will be the hardest part in our little project.
Yes.
The last part of the trade is largely the same as the Gen 2 one. Both players need to select a Pokemon, and this is then transferred over to the other game as an index. This won't be an issue in our trade because it's so similar to the Gen 2 one. After both players accept, we see the trading sequence, and at the end of it there's one last check to make sure it went successfully.
Right.
And now we've also finished the trade between the Gen 3 games. Let's take a little step back and look at the differences between the two trades. Let's start with something easy. The movement in the trading room.
Okay.
The way I solve this is to simply mirror the movement from the other player. Technically you can get the other
Mirror B jump scare.
player out of sync with this, but it's part of the fun. Okay, for the next...
So mirroring it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, because then you're not having to input in Gen 2. If you're mirroring the input in Gen 3, you, as long as you're just careful, you can finagle over to the chair just fine.
Next issue, let's talk about the game data check. For this one, it's best to pretend to be a Fire Red or Leaf Green game that has acquired both a Ruby and Sapphire gem.
Right.
This will allow us to make a trade with all Gen 3 games regardless of the progress made.
Yes.
For our third issue, let's take a look at the trainer card. It is impossible to make the trainer card resemble the Gen 2 games that you're trading with.
No.
So I decided to have some fun with this instead. I'll show you what I made at the end when we make a trade. And for our last issue, we have the conversion of a Gen 2 Pokemon.
So he had to make it, right? So therefore, having him make a placeholder value, like I explained, totally tracks.
With Gen 3 one, and back. Let's pull up the structures again, and take a look at how to convert them. Gen 3 added a lot more stuff that wasn't in the Gen 2 games, but let's start with some easy things.
I mean, like Gen 3, the biggest difference in Gen 2 and Gen 3, biggest that people are going to cite all the time, is that Gen 3 did add abilities. It's not as nutty as it is now, where we have ability 1, ability 2, and hidden ability. Most of it was just they had 1 or 2 abilities back in the day. God, there's so many things that Gen 3 added in the background, though.
We can already easily convert the index of the species, the health item, the total experience they have, all the moves and possible PP ups used, and the friendship value.
Yeah.
That's already a bunch done. Next up, we'll convert the individual and effort values of the Pokemon. Like mentioned before, these...
Right. Yeah, see how I mentioned IVs? So you should be able to... Well, no, those aren't DVs. This is the Gen 3 chart. I'm assuming because everything is maxed out, you could just set everything EV-wise to 0. God, IVs, though? How would you translate that to IVs? Maybe make everything just a flat 31.
Values work a bit differently between the generations. In order to convert these properly, we need to take a look at the formulas they are used in.
Okay.
When comparing the two formulas, we can see that the IV is equal to the DV times 2.
Interesting.
And the EV is equal to the square root of the stat experience.
Huh.
By doing these two things, the formulas will become largely the same again.
Okay.
Except for the influence of the nature.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about that in a bit. Let's continue filling in more data for the Pokemon. These values here are used in Pokemon
Those are the contest stats. Coolness, beauty, cuteness, smartness, toughness. Those are all contest stats.
contests. We didn't have those things in Gen 2, so we'll keep those values unused.
Yeah,
the
just keep those there.
works the same in Gen 3 as it did in Gen 2, so we can easily copy this value.
Right.
Next up is the Met location.
I feel you could get away for it with Met location with how they do it in modern games where like had a fateful counter came across space and time. You could just make a placeholder value for that.
We cannot use the value from Gen 2 and most values from Gen 3 don't really apply for us.
No.
But at the end of the list there is a value for Met in an in-game trade. On the stat screen it will then say obtained in a trade. This value is the closest thing to reality because it is obtained in a trade. For the oranges info, we can easily copy the gender of the original trainer and the level it was caught at.
Easy.
We don't really know what Pokeball was used in the Gen 2 games.
No, I mean, at that point, you could probably just... Wasn't it Sapphire Evolves after a certain point turned into something specific where you couldn't transfer them up? I thought there was a conversion for a old type Pokeball. I mean, no, I think it was the Virtual Console, right? Maybe it was Virtual Console? I can't remember. I thought there was... It will default to a Pokeball at some point. But... You could just do that. You could make sure that, hey, you're transferring it. Well, it doesn't necessarily check the Pokeball. You default it at a placeholder value of 0 or 1, whatever the Pokeball is. You could do that.
But we'll just use a normal Pokeball for this.
There we go.
And for the Game of Origin...
Oh, I guess 4.
You know there's a gap between Leaf Green and Colosseum? Let's just add another value and see if the game accepts it.
Huh.
Game of Origin, Gold, Silver or Crystal.
What?
Last in this list we have the ribbons. Ribbons aren't a thing in Gen 2, so we don't have to do anything here.
No.
But I feel like the Pokemon deserves a ribbon for clearing all difficulties.
Yeah.
It's not easy being converted to a Gen 3 Pokemon after all.
No, it's not.
And that was all the important Pokemon data. All this data will be checked by the game with this checksum. It is important to get the calculations correct because otherwise we will get a bad egg.
Yeah.
In this last column we have a lot more things we can directly copy from the Gen 2 games. The trainer ID, the nickname, the name of the original trainer, the status condition, the level, and all of the stats. And lastly, we have some Gen 3 only things. The language of the Pokemon will just be English, and the markings that are used in the box will just be turned off.
Yeah.
And last but not least, the personality value. This value determines a lot of things like gender, nature, ability, the letter of the unknown, and shininess. My plan with the personality value is to first generate an initial value based on the IVs, and then change things if necessary.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
There's a couple things I decided not to change, and that is the ability and the nature of the Pokemon. To make the calculations for the stats between Gen 2 and Gen 3 the most similar, I should actually choose a neutral nature for the Pokemon. I personally thought it would be more fun to not change this value and keep it random.
Right.
The same counts for the ability. I personally don't mind whether the Pokemon has its first ability or its second ability. But all the other things like gender, the letter of the unknown, and shininess will all be changed to make it the same as in the Gen 2 games. And with that, we finished our conversion for Gen 2 Pokemon.
That's actually a lot of conversions, to be fair. Like, that's a lot. It makes sense why Pokemon... You can see why Pokemon didn't really bother with Gen 2 to Gen 3 on official hardware now. You can kind of see why.
The other way around is a lot easier because all these values are present in the Gen 3 structure. There will be data lost when converting from Gen 3 to Gen 2, but that is to be expected.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, in theory, we have made a trade between Gen 2 and Gen 3. Let's make it a reality. I've designed my own custom PCB for this, and it's about time we assemble it and put everything we've learned together.
That's so cool.
On the PCB there are 2 ports for the link cable. One for the Gen 2 protocol, and the other for Gen 3.
Right.
Both of these protocols are programmed into the microcontroller. and that makes sure that the games can communicate with each other.
This is like magic to me. It's great.
Developing stuff like this, a lot of things usually go wrong. But honestly, that's part of the fun. Experiencing setbacks and overcoming them is one of the best things about these projects.
Ah, yes.
Anyway,
Trade room
let's put this
ASMR.
device to the test and make a trade between Gen 2 and Gen 3. What Pokemon will be the best to trade over? What will be the most iconic? That is, of course, the red Gyarados.
I could see that,
I
yeah.
made my way to the Lake of Rage just to catch it and send it over to my Fire Red game. And now we're ready to make the impossible trade between Gen 2 and Gen 3. Passing all the checks and getting into the trading room was easy enough. In the trading room itself, we can take a look at the trainer card I made. Pretty fancy, right?
Nice.
Don't mind those question marks. It's a feature.
It's
Let's
a feature.
close this trainer card up and make our way to the trading machine to let the games communicate with each other. And after everything going successfully, we can now see all the Pokemon from Gen 2 and Gen 3. Seeing that same Gyarados we just got to be shiny here in the Gen 3 games is
Interesting.
amazing.
Yeah,
For this
that's
trade, I've also
great.
prepared a little sacrifice on the Gen 3 games. You shall be missed. Anyway, let's select the Pokemon on both games and make a trade. Seeing this process happen in real time is great.
Oh,
Let's
absolutely.
accept the trade and watch the magic happen.
No, this is very, very cool. As somebody that grew up knowing this was impossible, this is very cool.
On Gen 2 we now have the sacrifice, and on Gen 3 we have our shiny Gyarados.
Huh.
When we take a look at the stats and compare them, we can see that the speed stat is a bit higher and the special attack stat is a bit lower.
You were close.
This is because of the jolly nature it gained from the trade. But
Okay.
other than that, all the other stats are exactly the same.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Having the possibility now to trade over my Pokemon from Gen 2 to Gen 3 is amazing. I love working on this project and I will definitely use this to send over more Gen 2 Pokemon.
Yeah.
And now that we've made a successful trade, this also concludes our journey to bridge the gap between the generations.
That's so cool.
Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
I wonder if it would pass a hack check in VGC. That's actually really, really cool. Like it's like just seeing like a myth just come to life. It's just seeing it just come to, that is amazing. And I'm very glad that this was even a video. If it could pass a hack check, I guess, technically, because if it comes over to Gen 3, it already has those. It doesn't detect it's from Gen 2, at least I don't think it would. It would just count it as a Gen 3 trainer, right? I'd be very curious, though. This was an amazing video. I absolutely love it. This was perfect to watch. If you haven't watched Goppier, excuse me, I said Goppier earlier. Goppier, if you haven't watched him, please go check him out. He looks like he's got a bunch of cool videos on the subject, and I wanted to do what I could to signal boost just such an amazing channel. I mean, this almost has 1 million views. That's awesome. He definitely 100,000 plus easy. He puts in a lot of work into his videos. I liked a lot of the editing that he did, and God, this needs to get signal boosted as much as it can. If you enjoyed this, let me know. If you also enjoyed this, definitely go check him out. What are your thoughts on trading from Gen 2 to Gen 3? Do you think that it pass a hack check? Do you think it wouldn't pass a hack check? Let me know in the comments section. I'll see you all in the next one.